So this morning, as I said before, I wanted to, I thought, okay, not just doing our Reformed heroes, otherwise I wouldn't have done Amy Semple McPherson. I've heard from more of you about that one in particular. Either, why did you do that? But also, that was interesting. So a fascinating story, and I wanted to talk about the rise of Pentecostalism, even though she would not be a hero for us. And I wanted to pick at least one Roman Catholic, did that last week with Tolkien, and someone from the Orthodox tradition, not Orthodox, small o, referring to those who have good non-heretical theology, but Orthodox, capital O, and I'll say a little bit more about that, a church tradition which we don't often think of. We think Protestant and Catholics, but there is this whole other tradition called Orthodoxy or Eastern Orthodoxy, and in particular, the man we're studying today is Solzhenitsyn, Russian Orthodox. Several books. I'm not an expert on Russian history, not an expert on Russian Orthodoxy or on Solzhenitsyn. I'd read some of him before. I learned a lot this week. There are lots of good books out there. This is a good biography, about 350 pages. Joseph Pierce has written some other biographies, Solzhenitsyn, A Soul in Exile. That's very good. This is really helpful. It's 250 pages, The Soul and Barbed Wire, an introduction. One of the editors here, I didn't realize this, Edward Erickson, was a professor at Calvin. I didn't even realize that Calvin professor was one of the Solzhenitsyn experts. So this is really great because it does a biography in the front in about 70 pages, and then it does a few pages on all of his major works and essays. Speaking of which, this book just came out. We have ceased to see the purpose, essential speeches of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. He can be very intimidating to get into. So this might be, if you think, I really want to read something, this is not a big book, and each of these chapters are 10 pages or so, and I'll highlight a couple of the key addresses in here, but this might be a really good way to get into his writing. And then the big one, which I have the abridged version, is the Gulag Archipelago. It's 3 volumes, 1,800 pages. This is really helpful, 465 pages in abridged version. Again, worked with this professor from Calvin directly to put this together. So this for probably most of us mere mortals would be more than enough to get us a feel for it. And I'll mention this book, which is really powerful and history-changing. For all its technological advancement and growth and economic prosperity, the 20th century was also the most violent, murderous, destructive century in human history. How many of you were alive for some part of the 20th century? All right, I see some young people back there. You didn't make it. Most of us did. Most of us didn't realize that Solzhenitsyn died not that long ago, lived to be 89 years old. And boy, I got tired of writing that name like 100 times in my notes. And I think I finally learned how to spell it. The number of people killed in World War I and World War II, combatants, civilians, 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, totaled 60 million. It's hard to even get our head around 60 million people. Another 7 million people, mostly civilians, died during the Russian Revolution, 1917 to 1922. Millions more died during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And if these armed conflicts weren't bloody enough, another 60 to 100 million, it's hard to get precise estimates, 60 to 100 million were killed during quote-unquote peacetime regimes of tyrants like Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot. The brutality of the previous century was not only worse than all previous centuries, it was, in terms of raw numbers, more murderous than all previous centuries combined. That's how bad the 20th century was. Now, you can think about reasons for these mind-boggling numbers. Well, there were more people on the planet, that's true. You can also say that the weapons of modern warfare made destruction more simple. We have weapons of mass destruction, and yet most of those millions were not killed by some nuclear weapon or atomic bomb. They were killed at the end of a barrel of a gun, or by mass starvation, or by prison camps. Virtually all of the so-called peacetime casualties were the result of state-sponsored violence under the grip of Marxist and communist ideas. It is not an exaggeration to say, I'm going to say this and say, well, this is trying to be political. It's not, it's a factual statement that no ideology in the history of the world has killed more innocent people by a wide margin than communism, which is why the subject of today's lecture is so crucially important, because one could argue that no single individual did as much to undermine the legitimacy of communism and expose its dehumanizing brutality as this man, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Could also talk at the end of the Cold War about the importance of Reagan, the importance of Pope John Paul II, the importance of Margaret Thatcher. So lots of people contributed. But in this long life, no single individual did more with more words and more courage to expose the brutality of communism. This fact alone makes him worth studying. In 1974, the Times of London called Solzhenitsyn, quote, the most famous person in the Western world. And he probably was. And what's often overlooked is that Solzhenitsyn was fueled by a very genuine Christian commitment. Now, I have not read all of his works to speak authoritatively on his theology. What I have read is of a general respect and certainly a deep appreciation for Russian Orthodoxy, though he has his criticisms we'll come to. But more than just general theism, that's often what you get in his works. You might just hear about God or the importance of religion, but it was also a Christian commitment. And that's missed when we think about world history, and we think about the fall of communism, and we think about Solzhenitsyn. We don't often think of him as a Christian writer. We think of him as a courageous political dissident. But Christianity was at the very core and essence of his message and what he was about. Aleksandr Isavich Solzhenitsyn, apologize for any mispronunciation of people and places, was born December 11, 1918, in a resort town, Kislovodsk, located in the southwest part of Russia. Boy, if my freehand map of the United Kingdom was bad, what I know of my map of Russia is largely from playing Risk. Yeah, but it's a big, long place over here, okay? And you got the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and you kind of go down here, and over here we got Alaska, and then over here we have Europe, and right here is in the western part is Moscow. Now that looks sort of like a tricycle or something, but he was born down here, a resort town. There were spas there in the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. His parents were peasants by background, most people were at this time, but uniquely, they had both received a university education. Aleksandr never met his father. You think of last week, Tolkien's father died very young. Think of how many people in this course, or a slave like Richard Allen who wouldn't have known much of his parents or his father. Here again, we have someone who never knew his father. Isaki, think of Isaac, we would say, died in a hunting accident when his wife was 3 months pregnant. So Aleksandr was born 6 months later. His dad died of a hunting accident. His mother, Taisia Zakharovna Sherbak, was the daughter of a prosperous Ukrainian farmer. She was a young widow now, had this child who never met his father, took her son, lived with her sister Maria for 6 years, and Aleksandr was raised in the Russian Orthodox Church. Just to remind you about orthodoxy with a capital O. So what's the difference? Western Christianity, as we would call it, which later developed as Latin-speaking Christianity, developed along different lines than Greek-speaking Christianity, whereas in the West, eventually Rome would become the center of Western Christianity. In the East, happens that I'll fly there, Lord willing, this week, Istanbul, Constantinople. Why they changed it, I can't say. I guess they liked it better that way. So look up that song. Developed in Constantinople. So there were some theological differences along the way that Orthodoxy did not accept the filioque clause in the Nicene Creed that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. But even before that, or before the official split in 1054, they were already developing on different lines. There were rivalries between, is the Patriarch of Constantinople or is it one of the bishops in the West who really has supremacy? And once the Roman Empire in the West began to crumble, the empire in the East continued another 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire. But as Muslims took over much of the old Roman Empire, the West and the East became separated. So they developed on different geographic lines, different theological lines. There is a lovely Orthodox church, St. Nectarios on Kuykendall. You can drive by their building. Some of us may be familiar with it. So different than Catholicism, not Protestantism, Orthodoxy. His mother took him regularly for prayers, for worship, though she was not personally devout. Eventually, his mother, Taisia, moved north to Rostov-on-Don, so just a little bit farther north up here, a coastal town. She went to look for work, and she left Aleksandr to be raised by the extended family. He was raised by grandparents and various aunts and uncles. The most formative influence seemed to have been Aunt Irina, who instilled in him a love for literature, appreciation for Russian Orthodoxy. Later, Aleksandr then moves back up north. He's reunited with his mother in Rostov, and she struggles to find steady work. The two lived for 10 years there in a tiny, ramshackle structure, 9 feet by 12 feet. So this is 6 feet, over 6 feet. So 100 square foot ramshackle structure, no indoor plumbing, barely eked out a subsistence living. When he had one pair of shoes or one article of clothing, he would have to make that last for years. Later, when asked to summarize his childhood, he said he could do so in one word: hardships. Likely very different than the one word that our children would use. For the first 40 years of his life, Aleksandr knew almost nothing except destitution, squalor, and hardship. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. He was a gifted student, a voracious reader. He excelled in school. He was introduced to different classics, Russian classics, also English and Western classics. He was, however, in the school indoctrinated in Soviet propaganda. At age 12, he joined the Communist Party. Their program, glad it's not called Trail Life, or we'd have to change the name, but It has a very young pioneers. I think, did I have any Christian programs growing up called Young Pioneers? But a very innocuous name. But that was the communist program for teens and youth. Later, he reflected on the religious and ideological change he underwent as a young man. He said, quote, "The party," meaning the Communist Party, "had become our father." It's interesting, a man who never knew his father, never had a father, latches on. It often happens. If you don't have a father, you will find a substitute father. He said, "And we, the children, obeyed. So when I was leaving school and embarking on my time at university, I made a choice. I banished all my memories, all my childhood misgivings. I was a communist." So he's indoctrinated in Soviet propaganda, and it works. It has its effect. He rejects the Christianity, the Russian Orthodoxy he grew up with, and he heads off to University of Rostov in 1936 as a committed communist. There he meets a fellow student, a chemistry major named Natalia Rashatovskaya. How am I doing? Don't answer that. Well, we'll just remember her as Natalia. And they get married in 1940, toward the end of their studies. In 1941, Aleksandr graduated with distinction, and he moved to Moscow to pursue further studies in literature. He had always wanted to study literature, but he had to study in university science and mathematics instead, and he later looked back and could see, and you'll hear why, it was the hand of God and providence that gave him a training and degree in mathematics, even though he was most passionate about literature. So he moves to Moscow to continue his studies. He arrives June 22, 1941, which happens to be the very same day of the Nazi invasion in the Soviet Union. So he was not going to continue with his studies. He tried to enlist in the army, but initially they declined him, but then a few months later he was drafted into the army. He eventually became an artillery officer. He was engaged in what they called instrumental reconnaissance, so placing microphones, the cutting-edge technology of the day, in strategic locations and coordinating and triangulating and using the sounds picked up by those microphones to determine the placement of the enemy. At some points, he was far away from the front lines, but eventually he was put in charge of a battalion in 1943 near the very front lines of the work. He was doing important work in the front lines of the war. He was decorated as a hero. He was promoted to captain. At the beginning of 1945, here on the Western Front, we have the Pacific Theater, of course, but it seems as if, after the success of D-Day and the Allied invasion in 1944, now we often forget because we think about the Anglo-American efforts in the war. There's also the war in Stalingrad and in Russia where the worst casualties are mounting. And it was always this uneasy alliance. Remember, the Soviets were on the side of the Americans and the Brits and the French in World War II, even though they realized that this was a very uneasy alliance. They weren't supporters of communism and Stalinism, but they recognized that they were fighting against the Nazis, and they did so valiantly. At the end of World War II, you could argue that no one came out better ahead than the Soviet Union. Western powers had been in decline, except for the United States, which comes out in a position of strength, but the United States is a long ways away from this activity, separated by an ocean. In God's providential ordering of things, put the United States of America separated by two oceans, bordering really two countries. Hard to have given a better situation. By 1945, the Allies can sense that the end of the war in the Western Front is coming to an end, and imagine that Solzhenitsyn is thinking about, I've survived this war. My time is coming to an end. Perhaps I can return to my regular life, the pursuit of my studies. And if that's what he was thinking, he could not have been any more mistaken. Because in February of 1945, Solzhenitsyn's military career came to an abrupt end. He was writing letters with a friend of his who was serving also in the army at another part of the war. They were exchanging letters, and everyone knew that your letters would be read by censors to see if you were passing along any military secrets, if you were giving away the location, your location, something that you wouldn't want out. And rather naively, though Solzhenitsyn understood that, he didn't think that the censors reading the mail would be concerned about many other things, but they were. Solzhenitsyn and his friend, in their letters, had written too openly about how they thought the Soviet Union after the war should be reformed, and that they preferred Lenin to Stalin and Leninism to Stalinism. Now this is, Lenin, of course, is the one who leads the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Lenin is gone now. Stalin succeeds him. And from our vantage point in the West, I think Lenin, Stalin, what's the difference? They're both communists. They're both not good guys, right? But within the Soviet Union, they represented two different strands. So Lenin, or Leninism, was considered more popular with the masses, with the common people. He was revered as the father of the communist movement. He was thought to be less personally vindictive than Stalin and more of a politician. Now, he was absolutely committed to the cause of socialism and communism, but without the bureaucratic apparatus and intense autocratic control that Stalin had. So from their vantage point, Lenin, hesitate to even put it this way, represented a more liberal approach to communism. So to be caught in your letters advocating Lenin versus Stalin was considered an act of treason. Solzhenitsyn was arrested by SMERSH operatives. SMERSH, don't they show up in James Bond, but as an actual counterintelligence agency in the Soviet Union? The name was coined by Stalin, a combination of two Russian words, roughly translated death to spies. So he's arrested by SMERSH. He's shipped to Moscow. He's subjected to a sham investigation. All of these are fake show trials. He is declared guilty of, quote, malicious slander, of founding a, quote, hostile organization, and for the crime of exchanging letters where they made fun of Stalin. They talked in very obvious code about the mustache, they called him, and didn't speak favorably about Stalin. For that crime, he was sentenced to 8 years in a forced labor camp. And 8 years was considered a relatively mild sentence. But not only that, after 8 years, the rest of his sentence was, quote, perpetual exile, to be banished to either Siberia or some Siberia-like place in the Soviet Union. 8 years in labor camps, the rest of his life in perpetual exile for some misplaced letters. And thus began Solzhenitsyn's 8+ year ordeal in the Soviet gulags. That term became known throughout the whole world because of Solzhenitsyn. It originated as an acronym. Of course, I don't know Russian, but it translates to something like Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. That the LAG part is the labor camps, and the G and the U is Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. So the abbreviation, they became known as the gulags. And I'll come back to his most famous work, the Gulag Archipelago, or archipelago, I'll say. An archipelago, of course, is a chain of islands. And so he coined this term. There's a map here in the front just showing the hundreds of labor camps, which he said were like floating islands throughout the Soviet Union, transportation hubs, rehabilitation centers, prison camps, labor camps, research institutes, which were kind of a softer form of labor camps, all of these, the Gulag Archipelago, this island of prisons throughout the Soviet Union. He is sent to a labor camp, and there he sees the best and the worst of human nature. During these years, I'll say much more about this in a little bit, he moves from a Marxist. His commitment was already waning in the war as he saw firsthand what was going on. So he moves from a Marxist to a lapsed Marxist to a skeptic, and by the time he leaves, he is back to embracing the Christianity that he grew up with. Later, he recounted while in prison, he met Christians who led him back to his roots. Quote, "Other believers influenced me, but basically it was a return to what I thought before." So 1945, he is placed in the gulags. In 1946, remember I said providentially he had studied science and mathematics, which helped him. In that 1946, he's transferred into what they called sharashkas. These were prison research institutes where scientifically trained prisoners were sometimes placed. So it was still a gulag, it was still a labor camp, but compared to where they could be, the people there, university trained, they could have a halfway decent meal. Working conditions were not nearly as extreme. They may even have time to walk around the camp. This particular camp that he was at was a Russian Orthodox seminary that had been retrofitted to be this prison camp / research institute. So he's there from 1946 to 1950. Let's not put too rosy a picture on it, but it's better than what many others experienced during that time. However, in 1950, he has an argument with the authorities at the camp, and he's kicked out of the Sharashka, and he's sent to a new prison camp in central Kazakhstan. And that's where he will stay then for the duration of his time in the gulags from 1950 to 1953. He worked day and night laying bricks, he worked in a foundry, and he worked in the mines. On February 9, 1953, exactly 8 years after his arrest, somebody was keeping track, Solzhenitsyn's imprisonment came to an end. Now, it's unclear whether he would have been released or not, even though his imprisonment officially came to an end, except that on March 5, 1953, Stalin died. And so he was released. He faced, however, to say released puts it a little too sunny. He was released from the labor camp, but now he had to face his perpetual exile. And he went to a small village in southern Kazakhstan called Kokterek, far from anything or anyone he had ever known. So yes, better than being in the labor camp, but he's destined, it seems, to a life of perpetual exile. He doesn't know anyone. Far away, this little village, he makes a living as a teacher. That's what he can do. And every spare moment, and this would be the pattern for the rest of his life, every spare moment, he wrote. Later that year, he is diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he was given only a few weeks to live. He was certain he was going to die. He took all the manuscripts he had already written, he stuffed them in a glass bottle, and he buried it in the yard. Maybe somebody could find it if he goes and he dies. He was given permission to take a 300-mile journey to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, so he could undergo radiation treatment. And amazingly, the radiation was successful. The tumor shrank. Eventually, he was cured of cancer. He wrote about this ordeal in a moving work called Cancer Ward. Many of his works were fiction, but they were sort of thinly veiled fiction, and the protagonist was his alter ego, and it was a story about him. He returned after that back to this little town, Kokterek, and he continued his quiet life as a teacher and a writer by night. Fast forward then to 1956. So he's living in perpetual exile, 1956. Here's somebody from Soviet history whose name you probably recognize somewhere in the back of your mind, Nikita Khrushchev. You may remember him from the drama with JFK and the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. Well, this is 1956. Nikita Khrushchev is the first secretary of the Communist Party. And he surprises the world by publicly denouncing his predecessor, Joseph Stalin, and blaming Stalin for deviating from Lenin's beliefs. Remember, this is the sort of thing that got Solzhenitsyn in prison in the first place. And Khrushchev says Stalin established a personality cult. He perverted the principles of communism. Now, everyone basically knew that Stalin was a really, really bad guy on the short list of the worst people in human history. Hitler, he's right on that. You got a top 5, he's on it. And they knew that, but this broke through a taboo. Here we have not just anyone, but the first secretary of the Communist Party saying this about Stalin. Now we think, well, why did Khrushchev do this? Was Khrushchev, he had just been reading the Federalist Papers or something, and he was, no. He wanted to shore up his own support, and he wanted to signal that he was better than Stalin. Everyone knew Stalin, almost everyone knew someone who had been killed by Stalin. People did not love Stalin. They might have said that they did, but they didn't. So he thought this was a way to shore up his own support, to show that we are entering into a better age of communism with me rather than Joseph Stalin. So this is the on again, off again thaw. It also took me, and I'm still not sure if, Nikita Khrushchev, the thaw. Now during this thaw, don't think that Soviet citizens were out in the streets and, having no kings protests or something and just, felt like they had freedom to criticize their government. Of course, they didn't. They didn't know when a crackdown would come. But in order to further distance themselves from Stalin, Khrushchev's administration canceled all the sentences of perpetual exile. So Solzhenitsyn's experience officially ends in 1956. He moves to central Russia, about 100 miles east of Moscow. He continues to teach and write. Early the next year, 57, he is officially rehabilitated. And the charge against him that was on his record since 1945 is erased. He then, you say, what happened? I erased it, to his wife, Natalia. Natalia divorced him in 1952. Can hardly blame her. She didn't know she'd ever see her husband again. She's alone. It's to her great detriment that she's married to a prisoner. Well, now that his record is erased, they remarry. In the early 1960s, so this thaw, now Solzhenitsyn is teaching, he's remarried, he's to his wife, he's in central Russia. So fast forward to the eve of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Some of this happens just days before the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. The Soviet secretary, Khrushchev, once again, he wants to push this de-Stalinization. Desalinization is what? Taking salt out of water? This is the taking Stalin out. So he allows for some liberalizing reforms. Fateful decision. So Solzhenitsyn senses there's again a thaw in the Soviet air, and he decides he's going to try to get one of his pieces published out in the open. He decides on a piece which has the name SHCH 854, which is the name of the identification number of the prisoner in this novel. However, the editor of the magazine that publishes this story, it's a relatively short novel, decides wisely to give it a new title. It's published in 1962 under the title One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Ivan Denisovich. The piece appeared in the most prestigious journal. Ivan Denisovich is not a real person, it's a fictional account. It appears in the literary magazine Novy Mir, supported by its editor, a man named Aleksandr Tvardsky. He's a reform-minded, wants to have some liberalization of communism. And amazingly, so this is a story, it's fiction, but it's obviously based on eyewitness experience. It's called One Day, the Life of Ivan Denisovich, because it details one day in a prison camp. And the editor of the magazine has to get it signed off by Khrushchev himself. We're going to publish this story, and amazingly, Khrushchev signs off on publishing this piece. As I said, it was fiction, but it was based on Solzhenitsyn's personal knowledge of the Soviet prison system, detailing one day in the life of a single prisoner from morning revelry to lights out. And it was the first time that the world and many of the Soviets really could see and read for themselves what it was like in a forced labor camp. Readers passed along copies of the work by the millions. Translations appeared almost immediately. Western commentators, not surprisingly, hailed Solzhenitsyn as an anti-totalitarian freedom fighter. Now, this is one instance where his work of fiction is not just an alter ego for Solzhenitsyn himself, but he creates this character, Ivan Denisovich Shukov, which is where this abbreviation comes from, it's prisoner number, who is a soldier who is wrongly accused, and he's put into an Arctic prison camp. There's a wide array of characters. This is what happens in Russian novels. There's just multiplying characters everywhere. Part of Solzhenitsyn's skill is sarcasm, well-placed sarcasm, and he's the master of understatement. And it's a good lesson too for writers. The more tremendous, grave, horrible thing you have to communicate, the more understated you can be. And part of the genius of this work is Ivan Denisovich gets to the end of this day, and he reflects and he thinks it was actually one of his better days in prison. This was a pretty good day, as it details all of the tedium, all of the mistreatment, an inside look at the Soviet prison system, the inhumanity, the cruelty, the tedium. There were noble characters in the book. Denisovich is something of a skeptic, but he's resourceful, intrepid. He has a kind of moral compass. Interestingly, the character in the book who receives the most attention, besides Ivan, the protagonist, is a man in the book named Alashka. He's a Baptist. He's a Christian. And he's portrayed as selfless, meek, confident in God's providence. And near the end of the work, Alyashka articulates a Christian understanding of life and suffering. And so if that wasn't the point of the book, it was certainly one of the points that Solzhenitsyn wanted the reader to consider, because the next main character after Denisovich is this imprisoned Christian in the camp. The publication of One Day changed Solzhenitsyn's life, and you could plausibly argue it changed the entire fate of the Soviet Union. Now you think, why did Khrushchev do that? Well, he made a tremendous miscalculation. What he expected is Soviets would read the work and they would grovel before him for being such an improvement to Joseph Stalin. Oh, praise our first secretary who has brought us out. It was a way of further exalting himself, distancing himself from Stalin. He thought he would get exuberant thanks for moving beyond this reign of terror and now to a better, truer form of communism. But he had let the genie out of the bottle, and it would never be put back in again. Publishers in the Soviet Union were then flooded with other stories and memoirs and reflections of life in prison. And ordinary readers saw in print, in black and white, what most of them knew to be true from hearing stories from family and friends. Most all had somebody killed in the gulags. And now, the lie that they had to pretend was the truth, they now had somebody telling them, no, it really was a lie. One of Solzhenitsyn's famous phrases, live not by lies. In October 1964, so this is 62, Cuban Missile Crisis is happening almost at the same time. 64, 2 years later, Khrushchev is forced out of power, in part because they said, you published Solzhenitsyn's work. And from that point on, when Khrushchev is ousted, the KGB, not the KJV, that's very different, the KGB follows Solzhenitsyn closely. They harass him. Now, he's still able to write somewhat openly through the 1960s. Why? Because he is so famous, he's so well known, and he is so revered in the West. That gives him a lot of protection that other writers, other dissidents wouldn't have, because he's famous around the whole world, and they know we can't just make a martyr out of this man. In 1970, his fame is further amplified. He wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. And then after this, the Soviets become more aggressive. KGB agents ransack his room. They beat up one of his friends. They send threatening letters to him and his wife. Once in 1971, the KGB tried to kill him. He was standing in line at a store, and someone poked him with a sharp device that was laced with poison at the tip. He developed blisters and sores and was bedridden for 3 months. Later, he learned it was the KGB trying to kill him, but he didn't die. Finally, sadly, his marriage comes to an end. You could sort of understand how any marriage under these circumstances would be difficult. However, Solzhenitsyn developed a relationship with a Moscow mathematician, last name Svetlova, and he eventually divorced his first wife, married Svetlova. It had never been an easy marriage, and he probably reasoned to himself that Svetlova was a spirited intellectual like himself, a better match, and maybe she was. But he later acknowledged his fault in pursuing that divorce. He didn't claim to be innocent. At the end of 1973, the first Russian language volume of the Gulag Archipelago appeared, not in the Soviet Union, but published in Paris. And not long after that, all 1,800 pages were published in Russian, then quickly several other languages. So 1973, the Gulag is coming out. Solzhenitsyn should have feared for his life, but strangely, perhaps naively, or maybe in the Lord's providence, just blindingly, he later admitted he never thought the KGB would apprehend him. And so, on February 12, 1974, he was genuinely shocked when a whole cadre of KGB agents broke down his door, entered into his apartment, and arrested him. He really didn't think that it would happen. They stripped him of his Soviet citizenship. They charged him with, quote, systematically performing actions that are incompatible with being a citizen of the USSR, and he was accused of treason. As a traitor, he could have received the death penalty, but again, the Kremlin is really perplexed what to do with Solzhenitsyn. They can't, from their perspective, we can't have him living in the Soviet Union, publishing these works that go out to all the world. It makes us look weak. He's publishing all of these defamatory accusations against communism and the Soviet system, and we look like we're indifferent to it, so we can't have him here. We can't kill him. That will just make him even more powerful. We can't send him to a gulag again. That's what he's writing about. So they come up with what they think is the best idea. They will send him off in exile outside of the Soviet Union. And so they send him to the West. Again, a providential miscalculation. They figured his star would soon fizzle. He's a big deal because he's here, and they think he's a martyr. Well, once he goes out there, it'll fizzle. And they thought, you know what? The rest of the world will look and see just how good-hearted and magnanimous the Soviet Union is, that we released him. But once again, they reasoned poorly. Undoubtedly, the most important work is the Gulag Archipelago. And let me just try to see if I have time to say a little bit about it before we wrap up his life. 7-part, 3-volume, 1,800-page masterpiece. By the mid-1980s, the tome had sold more than 30 million copies. This was not the book he wanted to write. He was most passionate about a book which later was entitled The Red Wheel, which was the history of the Russian Revolution. That's what he wanted to write. He said this book was like a big boulder that he had to push out of his way before he could get on with the rest of his life. He thought it was a debt he had to his fellow prisoners, to what he referred to, almost sounds like a sports term now, Zek Nation. What's that? Zek is the abbreviation for prisoner, the Zeks. He felt like he had to do this. He labored on it from 1958 to 1968. Mostly he was living at the time in Estonia. He researched the history of the Soviet prison system. He interviewed 227 eyewitnesses. He had lived in the gulags for more than 8 years. And so the book does a number of things. It's part history, part autobiography, part moral philosophy, part political treatise, part soul-probing personal reflection. The American diplomat George Kennan called the book the greatest and most powerful single indictment of a political regime ever to be leveled in modern times. And it's really hard to feel the effect of the book without reading some of it for yourself. There are sections on transportation, interrogation, arrest, rebellion, escape, death. As you might imagine, a lot of it is very hard to read, and he writes it without sentimentality, without thunderous rhetoric. The chapter on women, very hard to read. He says very matter-of-factly, your only hope was to be old and ugly. Devastating. The chapter on children and child torture tells a story that soldiers, and he said, the prison guards, even sometimes they were women, would not think anything about laying a man on the ground, spreading his legs, getting their steel-toed boots, and as he says, crushing the very organ that brought life into the world. It's just very hard to read, and yet you have to read some of it to know just how horrible it was. The most remarkable and important chapter, by most accounts, is called The Ascent. And it begins part 4. Part 4 is called The Soul and the Barbed Wire, which is why you get the title of this book. And the chapter is called The Ascent. At the beginning of part 4, he includes this epigram. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. 1 Corinthians 15:51. The chapter begins by recounting the tedium of life in prison. He says, for 365 days you stomp out to line up in a drizzling, slushy rain and in piercing blizzard and biting sub-zero cold. For 365 days you work away at hateful alien work with your mind unoccupied. For 365 evenings you squinch up, wet, chilled, in the end-of-work lineup, waiting for the convoy to assemble from the distant watchtowers. And then there is the march out, and then the march back, and bending over 730 bowls of gruel, over 730 portions of grits, and that is only 1 year, and there are 10, there are 25. Despite the drudgery, the torture, the suffering, Solzhenitsyn in this chapter marvels that there were so few suicides. He said, well, there were some, and some attempted, but he said, we can all tell more escapes than suicides. And he reflects, if these millions of helpless and pitiful vermin still did not put an end to themselves, this meant some kind of invincible feeling was alive inside them. And there's something in the human spirit. The key moment, he says, in prison comes when you are faced with the choice. Will I vow to survive at any price? Will I vow in my conscience and my heart to survive at any price? He says it's a test, it's a temptation. Will you allow your own misfortune to overshadow the whole world? He says this is the great fork in camp life. You can go to the right, which he means the right path, and you say, I will not do everything to survive. No, some costs are too high. Or you can go to the left and convince yourself that everything is justified by the singular goal of your survival. Here's what he puts very poignantly. If you go to the right, you lose your life. If you go to the left, you lose your conscience. He says freedom comes when you realize all they can do is take away your life. They've taken away everything, your family, your freedom, your property. They cannot take away your thoughts. He says the captors have less control over you than they think. Quote, and as soon as you have renounced the aim of surviving at any price and gone where the calm and simple people go, then imprisonment begins to transform your former character in an astonishing way. And in this chapter, he tells the story. He's in a hospital in the camp, recovering from surgery, and a man sits up with him all night and talks to him, Boris Kornfeld. And Boris Kornfeld tells him his life story. He was a Jew who converted to become a Christian. And he tells them about Christian faith. And he lays out to him and kindly stays up with him and talks to him through the whole night. And then, at the end, in the morning, he says that Kornfeld tells him something truly surprising. He said he had become convinced that no punishment, now just stick with me here. He said, no punishment in this life comes to us undeserved. Kornfeld said, if I go over my life with a fine-tooth comb, I will find more than enough transgression to justify every blow I have received. And Solzhenitsyn said he was coming to the same conclusion. And then the next morning, Kornfeld was let out, or he went to sleep in his room, and he never returned. Next time he saw him, he was dead. He had received 8 hammer blows with a mallet in his sleep. And Solzhenitsyn said, this last word from Boris Kornfeld was given to me, quote, as an inheritance. And he pondered it, and he thought about it. Now, you may be asking yourself the question, which Solzhenitsyn raises. Well, if that's the case, how do we explain that the people in camp who are most innocent are often most tortured? And how do we explain that the guards actually seem to be prospering, though they're the most wicked? And he says this, the only solution is that the meaning of earthly existence lies not, as we have grown used to thinking, in prospering, but in the development of the soul. This is why the chapter is called The Ascent. From that point of view, our torturers have been punished most horribly of all. They are turning into swine. They are departing downward, the descent from humanity. From that point of view, punishment is inflicted on those whose development holds no hope. They're the ones being punished. They have no hope. They're descending to become something subhuman. And this leads to the most famous sentence in the whole work. As Solzhenitsyn reflects on the fight against evil in his own heart and the first stirrings of good, he says, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." Let me just say as a parenthesis, this is incredibly relevant. Some critical theory tells you can just divide good guys, bad guys, oppressors, oppressed. Or, lest we let ourselves off the hook, you can just look at the world and say, there's the right and the left, and we know the right are the good guys, left are the bad guys, everything about it. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. Solzhenitsyn said, I realize that's not the line dividing good and evil. It goes through every human heart. And he says, they destroy only those carriers of evil contemporary with them. And then they take to themselves as their heritage the actual evil itself magnified still more. He said, that's what will happen to you if you take it as your mission to violently exterminate evil. Because the Gulag taught Solzhenitsyn about himself, brought him back to God, led his soul in an ascent to heaven, he ends the chapter, "Bless you, prison, for having been in my life." Now, that's not the very last word, because typical understatement, sarcasm, he puts in parentheses after that magnificent statement, parentheses. And from beyond the grave comes the reply, "It is very well for you to say that when you came out alive." So he's understanding, yes, I was one of the lucky ones to come out alive. Well, we must hasten on to the end of this story. He arrives in the West in 1974, first lands in Frankfurt, the other side of the Berlin Wall, then settles in Zurich, Switzerland. Soviet officials allow his wife and sons to join him. He's not just a star, didn't fizzle, he was a superstar. Invitations to speak, lecture, write, interview. By the end of the year, he decided it would be better to relocate to North America. And he was looking in particular for cold weather, snow, rugged terrain, woods. So he thought, Canada. Yeah, good thinking. But he could not find a suitable place and property in Ontario. So instead, he landed in southeastern Vermont, where he would live the next 20 years of his life. He lectured, gave interviews, continued to write poems, short stories, micro stories, novels, essays, longer works of history, autobiography, spiritual, moral reflection. But if people in the West who hailed him as a great hero, a great man of his age, if they thought that Solzhenitsyn would come to the West and only pat them on the back, he was wrong. You may have read before, you can actually watch it on YouTube. 1978, he was asked by Harvard to give the commencement address. A miscalculation from Harvard. Because they're speaking to this overwhelmingly secular audience. He goes on to blame the woes of the West on a bankrupt legacy of the secular Enlightenment ideas, and he calls them to rediscover the true roots of the West. Some people say he was anti-Western. He wasn't. What he called them to were the true roots of the West, which to him meant God, faith, Christianity. 1983, he received the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion, the first Orthodox Christian to do so. In 1985, he gave up on his previous plan to become a U.S. citizen. He had initiated the process, but when it came to taking the oath that said he would, without mental reservation, take up arms against every external enemy of the United States, he thought, I could never take up arms against Russia. And so he did not become a citizen of the United States. Very important for Solzhenitsyn. And he thought that Americans wouldn't grasp this. He made a sharp distinction between the Soviet Union and Russia. He thought Russia has this 1,000-year history. Russia is a Christian land. That's how he thought of it, Russia. But the Soviet Union, of course, hasn't fallen yet, was something different. He had the amazing prescience to see, when almost no one else saw, that the Soviet system would not last. The KGB bugged his room in 1965, and he's caught on microphone saying, "This is a government without prospects." When he was arrested, he said, "You Bolsheviks are finished. There are no two ways about it." He saw that this system could not last. Berlin Wall falls in 1989. Soviet Union crumbles by the end of 1991. He's a wildly popular figure. A poll was taken in 1991. He was the overwhelming favorite to return to the Russian Federation, as it was known, and to become the president. He was far and away more popular than Boris Yeltsin, who would become the president. But he delayed. People, why don't you come back? But he made the decision as a writer, not as a politician. He said, if I will miss my calling if I come back there and get co-opted into political service. That's not what I do. I write. But he did eventually return. May 27, 1994, he returned to his homeland for the first time in 2 decades. And he came by way of Russia's eastern edge in order to travel through the countryside to Moscow, connect with the common people. He did receive a hero's welcome, though he was surprised how few Russians had actually read him. In 1994, an interviewer asked Solzhenitsyn if he was afraid of death. "Absolutely not," was his reply. "As a Christian, I believe that there is a life after death, and so I understand that this is not the end of life. The soul lives on. Death is only a stage. Some would say a liberation. In any case, I have no fear of death." On August 3rd, 2008, he died in Moscow of heart failure, 89 years old. So what should we say? Wrapping this up, a couple of paragraphs. Solzhenitsyn once called the 20th century the caveman's century, one of the most shameful centuries of human existence. And in that Templeton lecture, when he received the Templeton Prize, he begins by noting, over 50 years ago, he said, he heard older people in the Soviet Union explain to him the disasters that had befallen Russia. And he said these old people gave such a simple explanation, quote, "Men have forgotten God. That's why all this happened." And he says, "I have been writing and studying and collecting and talking to eyewitnesses and researching for the last 50 years. And he says, I cannot improve upon what I heard from those elderly saints half a century ago. Men have forgotten God." That was his assessment of why the Soviet Union became what it was, and his warning to the West. But also hope. He's often thought of as just a writer of Jeremiads, just grim, dark, dystopian realities. But he thought of himself as an optimist, as someone with hope. In this biography, I'll finish here, from Joseph Pierce, he argues in his conclusion that the life of Solzhenitsyn represents a better ending than George Orwell's 1984. So George Orwell, who still had socialism in his veins, but not a totalitarian kind. You remember the end of Orwell's dystopian novel. The hero, Winston Smith, ends up succumbing to Big Brother. Big Brother wins. Truth is defeated. Pierce points out, with Solzhenitsyn, however, truth proved to be victorious. Now, I didn't live to see all of the many constellations and conflagrations with Russia since then. There's not a paean to how great Russia is, but rather the power of truth. Sometimes the pen truly is mightier than the sword. It is hard to fathom. God might have done it a different way, but it's hard to fathom the disintegration of the Soviet Union without one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich and the Gulag Archipelago. So Pierce says, in Solzhenitsyn's life, faith did move mountains. The dragon was cast down, and he ends with this line: truth is not only stranger than fiction, it has a happier ending.